This is Ranking the Colorado 14ers, Part 1. So I climbed the 14ers in Colorado over 3 seasons, 2018, 19, and 20. So first we're going to take a look at the peaks I climbed that first season in order. So first up, Mount Elbert. So the highest peak in Colorado is a pretty straightforward climb, pretty typical for the Sawatch range where this peak sits. It is the highest, but there's a few different pretty standard routes on it. That can be kept to just Class 1, maybe a little bit of Class 2. And this is a peak that I've returned to a couple times. It's great in the winter. You can definitely minimize avalanche risk going up Mount Elbert. So I'm going to go ahead and place this in the B tier. So the next peak I went for is Quandary Peak. This is a pretty classic mountain in Colorado. A lot of folks use it for training through the winter. A lot of different routes on the north, south, east, and west aspects of this peak. You can really choose the difficulty you want, from a really straightforward gradual climb on the east side to a ridge scramble on the west side. Cristo Couloir on the south side is a really famous and popular moderate snow climb for the spring. So for that reason, I'm going to go ahead and put Quandary with Elbert in the B tier. Next up, Mount Belford. It's kind of a forgettable peak. It's in the Collegiate Peaks wilderness, but not the most memorable climb. It is pretty steep, but pretty typical as far as 14ers go. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in D tier. Mount Belford is typically combined with Mount Oxford, which sits less than a mile away on a pretty high ridgeline, so it's pretty easy to connect the two if you've got the decent weather window for it. And really, Oxford just kind of comes along with Mount Belford. Nobody's really setting out to climb Oxford on its own. So Missouri Mountain is right next door, also to Belford and Oxford, just on the other side of the basin. And yeah, it's a little getting more into the Class 2 terrain, some loose rock up high. And I understand it does have some pretty nice couloirs on its north side. So I think Missouri Mountain is just a step above Belford and Oxford. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in C tier. Okay, the next peak that I went for is also keeping in the Collegiate Peak zone. This is Mount Harvard. And Mount Harvard is a pretty long day compared to some of these other peaks we've looked at. It's way back there in the Collegiate Peaks wilderness at the Horn Creek Basin, but also has a well-maintained trail to the summit and a pretty great view there in the middle of the wilderness with lots of other 14ers around. So after doing some of those peaks in the Sawatch, I went down to the Sangre de Cristo range, my first time down there, and that's definitely become one of my favorite areas in Colorado. And Humboldt Peak is situated right next to the Crestone Peaks, not too far from the Great Sand Dunes National Park. But Humboldt itself is a pretty straightforward climb. You just wrap around onto the west side at South Colony Lakes and take the West Ridge to the summit at a Class 2. Humboldt is not the most exciting peak on its own, but it's in a great area and it makes for a nice day, and you can camp out at South Colony Lakes. Okay, next up, we've got the classic combo, the Decalibron. That's Democrat, Cameron, Lincoln, and Bross. 4 14ers over by Alma, Colorado. There are some complex public land issues with these peaks, but it's an easy combo, and my first season I was excited for the chance to get 4 peaks in a day. So first off, Mount Democrat is probably my favorite of the 4. It makes for a fun route in the winter. It has a long east-facing slope to it, and just a pretty standard Class 2 14er. Then we've got Mount Cameron. Mount Cameron is an absolute joke of a mountain, and I really don't know why it's named or even considered to be on any list. It's 100 feet of prominence, really just a big broad bump on the ridge of Mount Lincoln, and it's really, you can't even tell if you're standing on the summit or not. It's just a football field up there. I'm going to go ahead and put Mount Cameron squarely in the F tier. Just an absolute disgrace. So just to hop over the saddle from Cameron, Mount Lincoln is similar to Mount Democrat. Just another Class 2 peak. Feels a little bit more like a mountain once you get up to the summit, which is just a little bit of a cone-shaped small area up there. Let's put Mount Lincoln in the D tier. Then we've got Mount Bross. So unlike Cameron, Bross is ranked, has at least 300 feet of prominence, but this is just a total slog. Bross is just an absolute loose scree fest. Pretty difficult footing, lots of erosion, and the summit's private property, so technically you can't even stand on top of it, which puts Mount Bross for me down in the F tier right next to Cameron. So actually the same day I did the Decalibron, I just wanted to keep going and actually drove over to nearby Mount Sherman and grabbed that in the afternoon. Was lucky to have no thunderstorms that day. And Mount Sherman, another really straightforward Class 2 peak. There's a lot of mining history in the area, which is kind of interesting to see. Considered to be one of the easiest 14ers for sure. Let's go ahead and give Sherman the E tier. Okay, so now we've got another combo, Torreys Peak and Torreys Peak. So these really super popular 14ers are just off I-70, not far from Denver. Get a lot of traffic in the summer on a weekend. Definitely going to be one of the more crowded 14ers you can visit. They are a combination with the standard route connecting the two peaks, so most people will try and do them both together. But both the peaks have interesting aspects on their own. Grays is the highest point on the Continental Divide and the only 14er, which is a pretty cool distinction. The standard route is another well-maintained trail up to the summit. The South Ridge of Grays has an interesting scramble on it, connecting over from Ruby Peak that I really enjoyed. And CDT hikers know Grays Peak is definitely a highlight of hiking the divide itself. So for that reason, I'm actually going to put Grays decently high in the B tier. So Torreys Peak, right next to Grays, is actually one of my favorite mountains in Colorado. It's just a really aesthetic peak. There's a moment when you're driving down I-70 that you can look to the south and get a great view of the north side of the peak. Just a really picturesque mountain, especially in the winter when there's snow on it. Torreys has a really interesting Class 3 ridgeline called the Kelso Ridge that connects over to Kelso Mountain. That's definitely one of the more classic scrambles in the Front Range. And there's also a number of couloirs and ski descents to be had on Torreys as well. Compared to Grays, it's a much steeper and just more aesthetic mountain. So let's go ahead and put Torreys in the A tier. It's really popular, but for good reason. So with those done, that brings us to the last peak I climbed my first season, and that is Long's Peak. After having climbed Kelso Ridge on Torreys, I was interested in doing some more Class 3 routes. So Long's Peak is definitely a step up from any of the other peaks on this list so far. The standard keyhole route is just a big day out. It's a really interesting high alpine route with various different sections you have to navigate through, from the boulder field, going through the keyhole, cutting across the narrows, climbing the trough, and then finally taking the home stretch up to the summit. But the interesting thing about Long's Peak is that there's so many different routes on it. The diamond face is just loaded with technical multi-pitch rock climbs that no other 14er has anything like that. There's also snow and ice climbing routes on all different aspects of the mountain, various technical routes like the Keyhole Ridge, the Cables route on the north face, Keener's route up the east face, Keplinger's Couloir, the Notch Couloir. So Long's is just the Colorado test piece for mountaineering routes of varying technical difficulty. And there's lots of other really interesting 13er summits that you can connect it with. The Long's Peak Grand Slam is one of the best big alpine days out in Colorado. And just its position as the highest peak anywhere around in the middle of Rocky Mountain National Park really makes this one of my absolute favorite 14ers, and I highly recommend it for anyone looking for a big day out on a really iconic Colorado peak. Long's Peak, absolutely squarely in the S tier. All right, so there it is, the first 15 14ers that I climbed in the summer of 2018. So decent mix there. A few peaks in the Sawatch that are just pretty standard, pretty simple. A couple really great climbs, a couple not so great, pretty forgettable climbs. But really just getting started and excited about working my way through the list of 14ers. So the next season, got a lot more into Class 3 scrambles, checking out different ranges, traveling farther and wider across Colorado to climb these high peaks, and just really building a skill set and a familiarity with the mountains that was just a really exciting journey. So subscribe to keep up with the rest of the series.